We're going to start talking about measuring the macroeconomy, and our focus will be on GDP, gross domestic product, as the primary indicator of the level of activity in the economy. We will break down GDP into its component parts. We will discuss the question of how to measure changes over time, and we will briefly discuss comparing economic performance across countries. By the way, you see the picture there. It shows the time period from 1992 to 2008. Using satellite images, you can see how South Korea has grown as measured by output of light, and how North Korea has remained stagnant. That's a really graphic illustration of how the difference between North and South Korea is a persistent difference and a very radical, dramatic difference. And it is also an example of the natural experiment, the experiment where culture, race, and all the other complicating factors are held constant, and there are two alternative systems, and after a long enough period of time we can look and see the difference in result from the two systems. So, as my notes explain in more detail, we will use as our primary measure of total production in the economy y equals c plus I plus g plus nx, the classic equation you would have encountered in principles of macroeconomics. And the first thing to remember or understand is that we will interpret this equation as a measure of production. There are alternative interpretations in alternative dimensions, such as income. That's not how we will think about it, though. We're not thinking about this from the income side. We're thinking about this y equals c plus I plus g from the production interpretation. Now, why do we choose the production interpretation instead of the income interpretation? Well, the production interpretation is useful in the sense that it clarifies why we choose the components we do, and it also clarifies the basic purpose for this thing called GDP. GDP is primarily a measure of production, and we care about production in macroeconomics because production generates jobs. If you think macroeconomics is partly about explaining high employment or high unemployment, then we would like a measure that helps us understand why employment is sometimes high and why employment is sometimes low. Now, the C is consumption of goods and services within a defined time period, and I is investment. Investment is the creation of new capital goods, like factories, for example. G is government expenditure. Now, government expenditure does not mean transfer of money from person A to person B. Government expenditure means like building a bridge or a road. NX is net exports. Now we understand why C is there. Consumption goods have to be produced and consumption services have to be produced. Investment goods and services have to be produced. Government goods and services have to be produced. But what about NX? Well, NX is exports minus imports. We understand that exports have to be produced. Therefore, producing exports is a valid component. Why do we subtract imports? That's the puzzling thing. We subtract imports because if we import a car, let's say, that would cause C to go up, measured consumption to go up. But we don't want that bit of consumption to count because we imported the car. We didn't produce the car at home. So we need to subtract it off somewhere, and the place we subtract off the imported good or service is in this NX element. That's the summary of why we measure exports minus imports. So, what things are included in GDP? Production of consumption goods, investment goods, and services. Every time I say goods, I mean services as well. Okay, production of consumption goods, investment goods, government goods, and exports. We are only counting final goods and services. We do not count intermediate goods and services because those intermediate goods and services get incorporated into the final good or service. We value things using market prices, which means we need market transacted goods and services in order to measure GDP. Why not home production? This is a controversial thing. People argue often GDP should include things that we do at home for ourselves. Like if I am cooking at home or mowing my lawn or looking after my own kids, why doesn't that count? It doesn't count because I am not creating jobs for other people when I take care of my own household. So, if you want to understand the level of employment, a household that employs a nanny or a caregiver for the kids is relevant. A family, a household, a unit that's looking after its own kids itself is not going to cause a bump in employment. Now, what a minute. What about the environment? Clean air, polar bears, don't they count? Are economists so narrow that they don't have a component in GDP for all these good things? Well, here's the situation. Clean air and polar bears are great, and economists love them as much as anybody. But remember, we're talking about production that creates jobs, a relatively narrow purpose for this thing called GDP. The person who looks after the polar bears, the person who's sent to monitor them and their health, and the person who researches how to clean air is probably employed by the government, let's say. That will show up under government services and will get counted. So caring for the good things like the environment and the polar bears does get counted, but we don't actually attach a dollar figure per polar bear because they were not produced. There were polar bears everywhere before we ever had such a thing as employment of human beings. Okay. Now the textbook and my notes get into detail about measuring changes over time. So you need to understand nominal GDP versus real GDP. the different indexes that are used, the concept of the GDP deflator, the inflation rate, and the equation that you see there, percentage change in nominal GDP equals percentage change in the price level plus percentage change in real GDP. That equation, by the way, is very important. And to get very technical about it, the equality in the equation is not strictly an equality, it's more like an approximation. The concept here is that when we want to measure an economy's GDP at a point in time, we don't have to worry about any of the things I've listed there. But when we compare change over time, we have to worry about things like inflation. And when we measure inflation, or the GDP deflator, we have to have some rules about how do we measure things and count things. And nominal changes in GDP and real changes in GDP are related to each other by the level of inflation according to the equation there. So just check the notes and check the textbook and be sure you understand these things. Let's take a quick look at global differences in GDP. And we're using data from 2013 and 2013 dollar amounts. And you see countries with different colors according to their GDP per capita. Now let's go to the next slide. If we compare countries with different GDP per capita, isn't that an easy thing to do? Don't we just take the exchange rate and do a conversion? Well, actually it's not that simple as it sounds, because different countries have different typical consumption baskets. So people are consuming different combinations of goods and services in different countries. Therefore, even if there's no currency difference, then we still cannot do a direct, identical comparison of what GDP per capita means. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that if your country's GDP per capita is $1,000 and my country's per capita GDP is $20,000, my standard of living will be higher than yours if I'm the median person, sort of the average person. So GDP is like a crude instrument that gets us at measurements of big differences in standard of living between countries. But if the difference is small, if you're Denmark versus Sweden, or Sweden versus Germany, and there's a couple of $1,000 difference in GDP per capita, then a higher GDP per capita doesn't necessarily mean you're better off, because culture is different, environment is different, climate is different, and so on. So GDP is useful up to a point in measuring large differences in standard of living. At this point, I would like you to watch the 3 MR University GDP videos. They are really good quality and they demonstrate exactly the things we've been discussing, and they will prepare us to move on to the next chapter. So, see you next chapter.